Welcome to Dog Life Radio.
All right, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining. This is Dog Life Radio, episode 44, and I am your host, Rossi Giugio. Thank you so much for joining me here today. All right, got something a little bit unique and special. They're all unique and special, aren't they? I say that every single week. But yeah, this is another cool guest speaker that we've got on for you today. We have got Dr. Gabe Sanders on the horn, I would say in the house, but he's not actually technically in the house. But Dr. Gabe Sanders all the way from Northern Kentucky University. So let me tell you a little bit about this gentleman and why he is such an interesting fellow. I don't think I've ever used the word fellow before like that. But okay. So Dr. Sanders is a professor of exercise science at the aforementioned Northern Kentucky University, but he's so much more than that. So he is a researcher and sports scientist. He's consulted with many different professional organizations as well as collegiate universities and pro MMA fighters. You will see a connection with Dr. Corey Peacock and some of his stable of MMA fighters. Anyway, we talk a little bit about that. But anyway, he works in the realm of sports performance to help research and analyze data to really get at student athletes and athletes in general, their training workloads, their physiological data, and basically looking at trying to reduce injuries, improving performance, and enhancing their health and well-being throughout their career over at the college and for pro fighters' career. Anyway, so this is a really, really interesting episode. Now, we get pretty into the weeds with some data and analysis, and those of you who know me know that I am a bit of a data junkie, so that's kind of cool for me. I love this stuff. But how it ties to you, there's a common theme from some of our past episodes with some of our past guests, as well as some of my own solo shows where my rants, and I was talking about your goals and how you can achieve them or how you work towards them. Anyway, the whole point here is it's all about baselining where you are so you can analyze what's happening to make those small tweaks to try to optimize your performance, to work towards your goal. Now, whether you want to become the best athlete at any particular sport, or if you just want to lose some weight, if you want to increase your strength, whatever, what have you, that's the theme. You're going to hear us talk a lot about that kind of a thing. We get into it, some really cool technology, wearable technologies to gather the data. Now, you'll definitely notice that maybe you won't be using the kind of technology that we're talking about in this episode, but the whole point is tracking information, and tracking the information can connect to tracking what foods you're eating, tracking what exercises you're doing, the repetitions, the sets, the weights, how easy it was, how hard it was, how often you're going to the gym, how well you're sleeping, all of those things. That's all of the data. When you think about data, that's what data is. That's all the data you should be taking a look at. Now, if you're not doing any of it, you start with the easy things. Start with just your nutrition. That's where I would start. Start there. Start with your sleep. That might even be easier. Are you getting enough? And you track it. Now, Dr. Sanders talks about some really fancy tools that he's using to help analyze the mountains and mountains of data that he is analyzing. But you can use a pad and a pencil. You don't need to get into some fancy programs out of the gate. But anyway, Dr. Gabe Sanders and I had a really interesting conversation. I'm going to take a quick break here for a second, and we will advertise our fantastic sponsors, Death Wish Coffee, and we will be right back with the podcast that you should be listening to, and then jump right into the convo.
Whoa, how did we get on this podcast?
I'm not sure, but I like it here.
It's pretty great, but we should probably tell everyone about our own podcast, Fueled by Deathcast.
Hell yeah. Comes out every Thursday from the Death Wish Coffee Company, the world's strongest coffee.
Every week you can hear me, the Incredible Jeff.
And me, the Amazing D-Man.
And we talk about new science discoveries, breaking news from Death Wish Coffee, and we welcome a special guest from rock stars to astronauts and ask them all the question, what fuels you.
The podcast is available right on deathwishcoffee.com and wherever podcasts are found, including iTunes, Google Music, Stitcher, and more.
Plus, you can now watch it live on the Death Wish Coffee Company page on Facebook and watch all our videos over on YouTube.
All right. Now you know all about Fueled by Deathcast and how you can listen to it.
But first, let's finish this podcast.
Let's get back to the show.
Now's part of the show where I get to remind you that you can follow me on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, all at Dog Life Radio. And if you are such a diehard fan of the show, remember you can now get merchandise. That's right, Dog Life Radio merchandise. Just go to sixsquirrelstudios.com and check out the store. That is 6 squirrel singular SQUIRREL studios.com. When you get there, take a look at the upper right hand part of the screen and you will see the Six Squirrel Studios store. Check it out. You can get t-shirts, stickers, hoodies, all kinds of cool stuff. So get your Dog Life Radio merchandise there. And lastly, not only do I appreciate you taking the time to listen to the show, remember to subscribe or follow, depending on, I guess, whichever podcasting service you utilize, but also drop me a rating on iTunes. Hit me up with a 4 or 5 star rating. It's the best way for people to hear and find my show. That's aside from you guys spreading the good word. And as always, don't be shy about sending me some feedback at dogliferadio@yahoo.com. Thank you. Wow, that was a really smart guy. Hope you listened to him. But anyway, before we jump into the podcast you should be listening to, I want to call your attention to the longtime sponsor of the show, Death Wish Coffee. Check them out at deathwishcoffee.com. And today, I happen to be rocking the Valhalla Java. This is the milder, smoother blend of their 2 proprietary blends. Fair trade, organic, certified, and just, it tastes damn good. So check them out. You can get them virtually anywhere, but I'm going to push you to go to deathwishcoffee.com. Check them out there. The world's strongest coffee. Believe me, I have sampled all of them, and I do love them. So they are the brand I had in my cabinet before they became sponsors, so it just kind of worked out really nicely. And with that, the podcast you should be listening to this week, episode 99 of Lore, Aaron Mahnke's podcast about various folklore stories around the world. A lot of them center in New England, or at least the northeast of the United States. But check this one out, Out for Blood, episode 99. The reason why I am saying this is the podcast you should be listening to is there's a crossover with another one of my favorite television shows, The Office, yes, with Michael Scott. In episode 99, they reference Belsnickel, and for those of you who do watch The Office will know that that is a character that Dwight, Rainn Wilson, played in one of the Christmas episodes. It was just funny. Anyway, there's nothing to do with health and fitness, just pure good entertainment. So check them out if you're looking for it. And with that, I thank you for listening and enjoy the conversation with Dr. Gabe Sanders.
All right, we're rolling. Thank you so much, Dr. Gabe Sanders, for joining me today. Truly looking forward to having a conversation with you. So first off, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
All right, this is great. So this is an interesting connection that I was virtually introduced or had some virtual networking with you, as I had a conversation a few weeks back with Dr. Corey Peacock out of Florida. And he and I had a really good conversation, and afterwards, off the air, had referenced, hey, you know what, you may want to have a conversation with my buddy Gabe. And I said, I would love to. So another I guess, blessing of social media and networking.
Yeah, absolutely. So Dr. Corey Peacock and I, we've kind of known each other since like 6th grade or whatever, but we've kind of continued on with our education, and then, we played football together, and then we did our doctorate together, and then we collaborate with research even to this day with athletes, and we've just kind of moved forward throughout our careers, so it's been really good.
That's interesting. I didn't know that you knew each other since you were in 6th grade. So even back then, did you have any ideas that the two of you would be heading in this type of direction?
No, not at all. I mean, again, we were both, we didn't go to the same school. We were kind of like rivals, so to speak, of like, junior high, high school type stuff. So it's kind of funny. We talk about that sometimes, but no, we never really had any intentions, at least I didn't, of pursuing my PhD or anything like that. And strength and conditioning or exercise science. He always did, and then it just kind of worked out once we finished with our masters and with college. We were both kind of working, and he was going to go back and do his, and I was like, I wasn't super happy at the time, so I was like, I'll just see what happens, and the rest is history. So it all worked out really well.
Absolutely, but so based on what so actually, maybe we should pause for a moment and actually do a little explanation of what you actually do, which is so interesting. So, Dr. Sanders, you're at, I was going to say NOCU, NKU, Northern Kentucky University, researcher and a sports scientist, specializing in sports science research, exercise science as well. What would your definition, if you were talking to the common person, the common man and woman, about what you do day to day?
Yeah, so I mean, what I do day to day, I obviously teach classes in exercise science, but one thing I focus on is the statistics and analytics portion of the sports science. So I work with the strength coach here at NKU as well as athletic trainers, and we monitor athletes daily, monitor them with wearable technology, which gives us tons and tons of data. So that's one thing I do, is I help them sort through the data, and then we basically build research projects for each team and each season based on what we find with the previous season. So that's really what I do at the heart of my research, is I work with and collaborate with the strength coach and the athletic trainers, and we use the technology that we have at our disposal here at this university, which is a lot, and we try to implement monitoring protocols to improve performance, nutrition, as well as the overall athletic performance.
Wow. So you hit on so many different things that I find fascinating with what you were saying there. So when you start talking about putting together analysis to approach an upcoming season, if we're talking about maybe a team-based sport, do you go into it like taking a look at how last season played out, taking a look at the data, the statistics, returning players, new players, and try to look at it from the perspective of, we want to obviously improve and win more. That's the problem you're trying to solve, and then dive into the data to look for the opportunities to bridge those gaps.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to give you an example, just when we first started this, we were monitoring the volleyball, and we, after the season, we found, so in our first season of monitoring, we looked at the data, and we found, and then we compared the actual performance data with their jump loads, and we looked at the jump loads throughout practice and games. We broke it into winning and losing, and then with that we combined the hitting percentages of the volleyball players, and we found that when they won, they had significantly lower jumps throughout practice 4 days prior to games. So we were able to quantify that 4 days out, 3 days out, 2 days out, and the day before. And we were able to quantify that between the winning and losing performances in games. So when you looked at the game performances, it wasn't really different between what they did in winning and losing games. It was really different. It was 2 days and 4 days. And the fact that they had significantly more high-intensity jumps in those 2 and 4 days before games when they lost. So that was the start of what we did, and we've really kind of progressed from there, and we do some stuff with basketball. We've looked at some metabolic changes, both with resting metabolic rate as well as maximal aerobic capacity, and we've tried to identify other factors that can influence in-game performance. So we've also found that sometimes, it really comes down to the high-intensity work, that when you overdo it, it seems to hamper performance. But at the same time, you don't want to go super easy. So it's kind of a fine line. And some of the way that we've analyzed this, we are getting some good information. And some of it depends on the type of technology we're using as well. That can change or alter what we're looking at, because the technology is different between Catapult, between Polar, and some of the other devices we're using.
So that actually, I was going to jump into that in a second as well. About you were talking about different types of wearable technology. So could you talk a little bit about some of the pieces that you are using today?
Yeah, absolutely. So we monitor volleyball with Catapult, because Catapult gives us jump loads, and IMA, so it gives us change of directions and some other metrics. But it doesn't give us distance because we're inside, but that's okay. So that's what we use with volleyball. But then men's and women's basketball, we use the Polar Team Pro system, which is very similar to Catapult, only it gives us the heart rate piece, really. Mm-hmm. So we get all these, acceleration, deceleration metrics, but we get the heart rate stuff. So the Polar is really nice because now we can look at heart rate, time spent in certain heart rate zones. And that's one thing we've really focused on. We've recently published a paper with women's volleyball, basketball, and to quantify different amounts of time that they spend in these heart rate training zones. So we're able to look at some key indicators, such as time spent above 85% max heart rate. The research has shown that that's kind of a key threshold in basketball, whether it's men or women's basketball, it doesn't matter. And we've really honed in on that quantifying the amount of time they spend in games and then in practices at that number, that 85% of heart rate max. So it's really interesting with the Polar. You can alter your training zones. So one thing we're doing this year is we're going with 7.5% increments to capture ultra high intensity zones. So it'd be like 92.5% of a heart rate maximum to 100%, and then from 85 to 92.5, and then working our way down. So again, that just helps us, improve the recommendations we give to the coach to improve either practice intensity or back off or whatever that may be.
Okay, I was just going to jump there and say this has got to be some of the stuff that's directly tied to your intensity and then getting back to your success metrics as well. So you're jumping there. Now, you had mentioned something about comparing the men and women. Have you noticed much of a difference in some of your data collections generically or in general between female athletes and men athletes, or male athletes, I should say?
So that's difficult to say because of the difference in coaching style. You know what I'm saying? So that is it's to answer your question. Yes, there is a difference, but it is not really in anything more than just the difference in coaching style at this point. Okay. That when we look at the men's and women's data. But collectively, from a game day perspective, it's really similar as far as their intensities. So, I mean, does that make sense when I say intensity? Yeah. So the time spent in 85% above is really similar overall between men's and women's. Again, there's differences in style in that, for example, our guards in men's basketball do a lot more work than centers and forwards, with the exception of one center. But then, like in women's basketball, the forwards are a little bit more than the guards, but that's just due to the style of play and the type of coaching. Does that make sense?
Yes, it's not a gender-based difference.
Correct.
Got it. No, that makes sense. It's something that I was thinking about it over the past year when I was watching different CrossFit games and different high intensity performance sports, and there are some differences between the performance levels between the genders, but yet when you're taking a broad spectrum look, the training and approach to these individuals are using I imagine, because I obviously don't know all of their training practices, don't vary that much based on approaching two similar events. So if there was a similar style and tactic for a sporting event, the intensity levels would be similar.
Yeah, I mean, that's really what it boils down to is looking at how each coach engages their athletes throughout practice and then comparing that to what they do in games and ensuring that whatever they're doing in games, they're kind of mimicking strategically in practice at certain times throughout the week. And it really, that's really what it comes down to, and not so much just differences in gender or sport. It's really, even within the sport, it's different based on style.
Yep. Okay. Now, we were talking about Dr. Corey Peacock earlier, and you've done some work with him as well. How have you transitioned some of this, or how much have you transitioned and applied towards athletes in mixed martial arts?
Yeah, so that's something we have recently started with the wearable. We have some data on with the catapult devices on fighters. So I went down there a few months ago, and we put these devices on fighters during their both their stand-up, and we even had them, go ahead and wear it when they were doing takedowns and stuff like that. And it's pretty interesting. So you do get a difference in movement style, I guess would be a good way to say it. Again, this is all tracked through the devices, but between fighters who are more likely to stay on their feet versus fighters who are more likely to engage in more, BJJ, wrestling, that type of deal. So again, what does it all mean? We don't really know yet, but one thing that we have done and are really starting to take a look at is we have 30 some max tests on some of these elite guys, and we're really going to start to look at some of their carbohydrate utilization from these tests, as well as their time above an RER of 1.0 and then 1.1. So we're looking at how hard can they push themselves, as well as we're going to start to look at carbohydrate utilization and just see if there's any way that we can use that information to improve, recovery, post-practice, nutrition recovery, and maybe that'll help with weight cuts and stuff like that in MMA. So it's all speculative at this point. We haven't been able to get into it a lot, but that is our goal and kind of where we're going with it.
Okay, very cool. So you had just mentioned RER, and I just want to make sure that's a respiratory exchange ratio, just how they're breathing. Got it. Okay.
Yes.
Well, just making sure everybody following you. You're throwing a lot of knowledge.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No, don't worry. It's good. This is really interesting stuff. I would imagine with MMA, because of, I guess it depends on the training style of what's going on, but with, like you were saying, if you've got somebody who's, doing more grappling, wrestling, Brazilian jiu-jitsu on the ground versus the stand-up, but if you're into a session of full-on sparring where potentially it could go anywhere, the data collection could become incredible, the amounts of data that would be coming back.
Yeah.
And then with the way they push in those
it's
sessions.
really fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. Go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, especially with the way that MMA fighters push themselves in their training programs, not that other sports don't, but the intensity levels of full-on training camps peaking up for a fight have got to be phenomenal.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I mean, we look at we have some data on one of our friends who is he's a world champion boxer, Chris Algieri, and we have some interesting metrics on him as far as his training load with the catapult devices, and it's pretty interesting when you look at these elite fighters, because the way that they push themselves is really insane compared to, and again, when we say push themselves, we're looking at data between football. So catapult device data between football, these fighters, or volleyball, and I mean it's nearly double what they would do in any given session. And again, that's with the time. Like that's if you were to consider the time being equal. I mean, we've looked at this stuff and we've just kind of been taken aback. Like this is insane. And then when you look at the heart rate data that corresponds to it, I mean, you're talking 95% of their max that I can't give you the exact number, but a much longer duration than anything that we've seen with other, like elite college athletes.
When you think about it, it's definitely amazing. And you think about a 5-minute round of all-out fighting where it can go anywhere, every muscle, every skill set, in comparison to say football, where you've got a play where you're going all out, and the collisions could be comparable, if not exceeding those you might see in a cage, but they're done relatively quickly. And I've seen different statistics in comparison to the amount of time that a 6-hour baseball game, there's actual action. You're talking minutes. So when I hear you talk like you just did, I think yes, I can absolutely believe that.
Yeah, and the number of peaks that they get. So that's one thing that would be interesting is to really break it down. You'd have to do some big time data mining to do this, but it's possible. But is to look at the number of peaks, the number of times like a fighter would peak at their maximum heart rate intensity, throughout a 5-minute round or throughout a training session or whatever. I mean, based on what I found, I would. I don't know how many times they would do it, but I can guarantee you that it is many, many more than what most other athletes would do throughout a training session, just because, like you said, they have to keep their heart rate up throughout their training to mimic that type of exertion through a 5-minute round. It's incredible.
Yeah, absolutely. So you had mentioned you were starting to get into, you were starting to look at carbohydrate intake, and it just leads to a question about how much analysis do you do in regards to overall nutrition as well?
Yeah, so that's a tricky thing. And what we started to do is we use this technology called muscle sound. So this is separate from looking at carbohydrate oxidation rates, but as far as monitoring nutrition, we started it this season with volleyball, and we're going to be progressing it to men's and women's basketball as well here. But muscle sound is a high-frequency ultrasound that takes a scan of a muscle. So we just scan the rectus femoris muscle, and you can do other muscles and whatnot, but the rectus femoris is really kind of the main muscle that's ever looked at not with just high frequency ultrasounds, but with muscle biopsies, that and the vastus. But anyways, so it's a way the muscle sound is the software, and it analyzes muscle glycogen content, and it gives you a score rating of 0 to 100. All right, and so what that does is it allows us to identify the fueling of our athletes. So it's interesting because this is I want to say it's several years old, the technology, and it's been validated in the research to this point. There really hasn't been anything that has been published in the research to really go against it. And it, so we have also started to look at what the girls are telling us. I say girls because we just look at volleyball at this point, like what they're telling us subjectively about their nutrition that corresponds to these scores. So what has happened is throughout their training camp, their scores were significantly higher than what they are right now. And so when we look at all these variables in training camp, they were getting training meals. They were getting fed, so this is a mid-major Division I school. So once school started, they no longer were receiving training tables. They didn't get the food like handed to them every day like they were in camp. And every single athlete has just like plummeted from their fuel scores from the muscle zone. So when we pair that with how they're responding to us with their nutrition, I mean, it's telling a very compelling argument that this technology works to monitor nutrition. And then, so it is something that it is some of the glycogen replenishment. It is more than just ingesting a little bit of sugar after a workout and whatnot, because we've experimented with several of the athletes throughout this by just giving them an orange juice before and after practice, and it did not budge their glycogen content scores like you might think it would. So it's interesting. It's very interesting, but that is helping us understand what they need. So we have a good idea now by looking at what they were doing in camp versus what they're doing the rest of the season here. And it was about a 3-week decline in their scores, and now they've just kind of leveled out at the bottom and haven't really changed much, which makes sense because now they're kind of in their habits throughout the semester. They got school. They're stressed out. They're stressed out with their sport, their classes, their tests, exams, everything else. So it's interesting. But we're trying to make the argument now that this is the type of food that we need to get them. This is the type of support we need from the university to help ensure that our athletes are eating right, eating adequately, and are optimally fueled.
So another variable, well, not a variable, it's just a fact. You're talking about monitoring collegiate-aged individuals as well. Obviously, they're playing college sports. So have you done any projects or testing on adults after their collegiate careers, looking at the differences as they age through the end of their 20s or in the 30s or whatever?
No, we have not done that here. But it would be interesting. So, I mean, I have some thoughts on that, just based on my own experience and whatnot. But I think typically people go one of two ways after they play college sports. They either make a significant change to their lifestyle habits and they reduce their weight, they increase their fitness or tone up or however you want to think of it, or they continue to eat like they do, only their activity levels significantly decline, and they tend to become overweight, unhealthy, and that type of deal. So at least that's what I saw from playing football in college. I saw that you saw people kind of go one of two ways, and it was most likely because, you don't engage in that type of practice, that many practice sessions and that type of training. And if you don't change your eating habits, you're going to end up gaining weight and becoming more unhealthy. But it really takes a conscious effort to change what you're doing after college in order to improve your health, or else you keep eating like that with no training. It's a recipe for disaster.
Absolutely. Even if you are training, I would think as you age, your body your body performance is very different when you're 22 versus when you're 35 and when you're 45. So I've entered that mid-40 range, and definitely agree with you there. When you're especially when I think maybe if you're even focusing on potentially like linemen, offensive and defensive linemen, things like that, where they're really trying to stay bulked up for their positions and they're eating that many calories throughout the day, it becomes very easy to just continue to eat that way, and then even though you don't need to weigh 300 pounds anymore.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I know I only have a couple more minutes with you, and I just have one other question. You had referenced a lot of different types of technology, wearable technologies that you've been using to gather all this information and all this data, and it's just mind-boggling to me how much pieces of data that you are gathering from a variety of sources. What types of tools are you using to actually do that data mining and that analysis?
So it starts with the technology manufacturers. You can export as a CSV file, which is an Excel file, basically. Yep. So what I do is I compile all that into an Excel file, and that allows me to go in after the season And if I need to do it throughout, I can. But there's a lot of, I call it coding, but it's just assigning numbers to groups of data sets. So that way I can do further breakdowns in the stats. So I then export all my Excel files into SPSS, which is the statistical package for the social science. So some people like to use R. R is there's like it's a free. You can download it free online. You can download packages and all this stuff. But it's really whatever software package you use. It's really what you get used to. But yeah, I use SPSS, and I have it really figured out between what I do in Excel and how I prepare the data to do the data mining, so to speak. And then once I get it into SPSS, I can bin variables based. When I say bin, I can just like categorize variables based on middle, 33%, middle 33, bottom 33, or quartiles or anything like that. And then we can start to do comparisons and regressions to do predictive analysis and stuff like that. So it's taken me quite a few years to get to the point to where I understand the statistics like I do now, and I think it's something that I continue to learn about.
It's interesting. That's interesting to me. It is. I'm a data guy, continuous improvement and all that kind of stuff, but this is definitely that on steroids. So I had to ask the question about the tools and technology. So with that, I wanted to wrap up, and thank you so much, Dr. Sanders, for taking the time today. Is there any website or any social media or anything like that you'd like to plug before we wrap?
Yeah, sure. I'm my Twitter account, I keep that pretty professional with just research and sports science, and that's you can follow me at Gabe J. Sanders. I also have a website, allinstrength.com, which I kind of post my research articles on there. I'm also will have some sample analysis and whatnot on there. So anything I do professionally, I put on the website as well. And I also, in terms of the analysis book, I wrote a book. It's like a textbook manual on using SPSS and identifying the SPSS outputs and making proper interpretations from the data. And that book is it's available on Amazon, and it's called Data Analysis in Sports Science. And Dr. Peacock actually, wrote a chapter and a foreword on that too. So we got his expertise in applying the data as a chapter in that textbook too. So that's a text and manual we plan to expand moving forward.
Very cool. Very cool. So Gabe J. Sanders on Twitter, and we've got allinstrength.com as the website. I'll plug all this stuff in the notes on this one once we get this one ready for dropping it for all the audience to hear. Thank you so much, Dr. Sanders. I really appreciate you taking the time.
All right. Thank you. Appreciate it.